Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive?
Always right.
Awesome. Today we're heading back to ancient Greece to explore the ideas of a guy named Plato.
Plato. Quite the thinker.
He really was. And today we're tackling some of his most thought-provoking ideas, like his critiques of democracy.
Yeah, he wasn't exactly democracy's biggest fan, was he?
No, not really. In fact, he thought it was a pretty terrible system.
Really? Why is that?
Well, we'll get into all that, but first, let's set the stage. We're talking about Athens in the 4th century BCE. A pretty turbulent time.
Lots of internal strife and external threats, wars and rivalries with other city-states.
Right. And Plato lived through all of that, witnessing firsthand both Athens' triumphs and its downfalls, especially during the Peloponnesian War.
That war had a huge impact on his thinking.
It did. And, it really makes you think, how do these historical events shape the ideas of these great thinkers?
Oh, absolutely. And in Plato's case, seeing this system, this young democracy struggle, probably really influenced his views on power, leadership, and what makes a society truly successful.
Totally. Our source for this deep dive, this Legends of Thought episode, does a great job of setting the scene. Imagine 4th century BCE Athens, this young democracy.
Facing all these challenges.
Yeah, and witnessing this firsthand probably shaped Plato's view on power and leadership.
Definitely. It's not hard to see how the war, and especially Athens' eventual defeat, would have a profound impact on his thinking. He believed that the city's downfall was at least partly due to poor decisions.
Made by the democratic leadership.
Exactly. This experience likely fueled his skepticism about leaving crucial decisions to the masses.
Okay, so let's get into the heart of his critique. Plato didn't hold back when it came to expressing his doubts about democracy. He argued that everyday citizens, well-intentioned as they might be,
they often lacked the knowledge and expertise to make sound judgments about complex issues.
Exactly. And he used this really vivid analogy of a ship to illustrate his point.
The ship analogy.
Yep, that one.
Yes, I love that one. He compared a democracy to a ship where everyone, regardless of their skill or understanding of the sea, wants a turn at the helm.
Imagine that. A ship veering wildly off course with everyone fighting for control. That pretty much sums up his anxiety about potential chaos and poor decision-making in a democracy.
It's such a powerful image, isn't it?
It is. So if democracy was so flawed in his eyes, what was the alternative? What did he propose instead?
Well, this is where his concept of the Philosopher-King comes into play. For Plato, the ideal ruler wasn't someone who inherited power or won an election. It was much deeper than that.
So not your typical politician?
Nope, not at all. They needed to possess something more than just power or ambition. They needed profound wisdom.
Like deep ethical grounding?
Yes, and a dedication to the common good above all else.
Wow, it's quite a tall order.
It is. He envisioned leaders who were essentially philosopher kings, individuals who had undergone years of rigorous training in various fields.
Like mathematics and science.
And, of course, philosophy.
So it wasn't just about being smart or well-educated. There's a deeper kind of wisdom he was looking for. What did he mean by the good that these philosopher kings were supposed to pursue?
That's a really great question, and it's something that's been debated for centuries. For Plato, the good wasn't about individual happiness or material wealth.
It was something bigger.
Much bigger. He believed it was a higher universal concept, something that transcended personal desires.
So not just what's good for me or for you, but for everyone. Like a shared vision of a truly flourishing society.
Exactly. And to achieve that vision, you needed a leader who wasn't swayed by personal ambition.
Or short-term gains.
Right. They needed to be deeply rooted in those ethical principles, capable of making decisions for the benefit of everyone, even if those decisions were unpopular.
So tough decisions that might not please everyone in the short run, but ultimately lead to a better outcome for the whole society.
Precisely.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get why Plato felt so strongly about this. But did his personal experiences beyond the war also shape his thinking? Our source mentioned an event that might have played a role in his distrust of leaving power in the hands of the masses.
You're probably talking about the trial and execution of Socrates.
Socrates, Plato's own teacher.
Yes. Socrates was condemned to death by a democratic Athenian jury, even though many considered him a wise and just man, including Plato himself.
That must have been incredibly traumatic for him, to see his own teacher condemned by the very system he was questioning.
Absolutely. Witnessing this firsthand must have had a profound impact on Plato. It raises a lot of questions, like, did he see this as an example of democracy's potential to make grave errors, to condemn individuals who, in his view, were truly virtuous?
It makes you think. Was democracy, in his eyes, susceptible to manipulation, emotional appeals, and potentially unjust outcomes?
Those are definitely questions worth pondering.
It also highlights how even the greatest philosophers are shaped by their own experiences. Their ideas don't just come out of nowhere.
Right. They're living, breathing individuals influenced by the world around them.
So we have Plato, deeply skeptical of democracy, after witnessing Athens' struggles and the tragic fate of his mentor. And he proposes this radical alternative, the Philosopher-King. But how do you actually find and train these superhumans?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll explore in part 2 of our deep dive. Plato had some very specific ideas about the education and development of these philosopher kings.
It's definitely a demanding path.
Oh, you can say that again?
Back again for more Plato. Last time, we left off with this idea of the Philosopher-King.
And all the reasons why Plato wasn't too keen on democracy. Too many flaws, he thought.
Yeah, like giving everyone an equal say, regardless of their, well, their knowledge.
Expertise, right. Plato seemed to think that was a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. He really believed that just like you wouldn't let a random passenger steer a ship, you shouldn't entrust an entire society to people without the right training.
And wisdom, too.
So, his solution. Hand over the reins to these elite philosopher kings. Spend years honing their minds, understanding justice. The good, he called it. It sounds a bit like, I don't know, a utopian dream.
It's a pretty fascinating concept, though, isn't it? Think about it. Leadership based not on power or popularity, but on wisdom, on serving the common good.
It's a big ask.
Huge. Plato knew that finding and training these individuals would be a huge task, but essential, he argued, for a truly just and harmonious society.
Okay, so imagine this society working. Do the philosopher kings just make all the calls, or do citizens get a say?
That's where things get interesting. Plato was all about structure. He envisioned society divided into 3 classes, each with a specific role. You might remember this from Philosophy 101, the philosopher, warrior, worker framework.
Oh yeah, I think that rings a bell. Like a pyramid, right? With the philosopher kings at the top, all wisdom and reason.
Precisely. They're the big decision makers, steering the ship of state, so to speak.
Then you've got the warrior class, all about courage and strength, protecting the state, maintaining order.
And at the base of the pyramid, the workers. Producers, keeping everything running smoothly.
Each piece vital, like a well-oiled machine.
Plato was all about balance and harmony, making sure each part functioned for the good of the whole.
Makes me wonder, though, how would people move between classes? Could you, go from worker to warrior? Or even to philosopher-king?
Another great question. Plato believed that, ideally, individuals should stick to what they're naturally suited for. But he was also big on education. Everyone should strive for, virtue and excellence within their role. He imagined a system where people with exceptional abilities.
They could be identified, nurtured.
Exactly.
Right.
And potentially, rise to a higher class if they showed real merit.
So some room for movement. But overall, the focus was on fulfilling your role within this very specific structure.
That's right. Plato saw this structured society as essential for stability, for preventing the chaos he associated with democracy.
Given his experiences, it makes sense. But did any real societies ever come close to this vision?
It's tough to say. There have been societies with, strong philosophical traditions, wise rulers, but none that perfectly mirror Plato's ideal state. Some people draw comparisons to ancient Sparta.
With all that military training, discipline.
Right. But even that's a bit of a stretch.
So more of a theoretical model than a practical how-to guide for government.
Probably fair to say that. But remember, even if Plato's vision never fully materialized in the real world, his ideas have had a huge impact on leadership, on virtue, on social harmony.
Okay, I'm curious, how did his ideas actually influence later thinkers? Did anyone try to create a philosopher-king society?
Well, no one exactly created that society, but his emphasis on wisdom and virtue and leadership, that really resonated with lots of thinkers and rulers throughout history.
Give me some examples. Who are we talking about?
Think about the Middle Ages in Europe. Some monarchs justified their rule by claiming this, like divine right to lead.
God-given wisdom, authority to rule.
Exactly. So they weren't philosophers in the classical sense, but
they drew upon that idea. The leader with superior knowledge, chosen by a higher power, like a divinely appointed philosopher-king.
In a way, yes.
And what about modern times? Can we see any traces of Plato's thinking today?
Absolutely. Think about the debates we have now about the role of experts in government.
It's like, should our leaders be the most popular or the most qualified?
That's the tension. balancing democratic principles with the need for real expertise. And that's something Plato was already grappling with, over 2,000 years ago.
It's pretty amazing how these ancient ideas are still relevant today. We've talked about Plato's critiques, his Philosopher-King vision, the structure of his ideal society. But what about the downsides? Are there other criticisms beyond the whole tyranny risk?
Plenty. One major criticism is that Plato's system is just fundamentally elitist, undemocratic.
Yeah, I can see that. Putting all the power in the hands of a select few,
Yeah.
it basically excludes everyone else.
Exactly. It raises a lot of concerns about individual freedom, representation, the right to participate in shaping your own society.
It also assumes that wisdom and virtue are, exclusive to this elite group.
Right. What about the possibility of wise and ethical people emerging from other walks of life?
And who gets to decide who's wise enough to rule anyway? That seems pretty subjective.
That's the heart of the issue. Plato had this whole education system he envisioned to identify and nurture potential philosopher-kings. But even with the best intentions, human judgment isn't perfect.
Nope. Lots of room for things to go wrong, no matter how well-intentioned the system is.
Absolutely. Which brings us to another major criticism, the lack of checks and balances.
So, no real way to hold these philosopher-kings accountable if they mess up or stray from their commitment to the good.
Plato thought their philosophical training would be enough of a safeguard. But as we've seen, even good intentions can get twisted.
It's this tension, isn't it, between a perfectly just society ruled by philosopher-kings and the messy reality of human nature.
That's what makes Plato so fascinating. He makes us confront these really big questions about power, about justice, about how we should organize ourselves as a society.
So alluring, but with its own set of pitfalls. Is there anything we can actually take away from Plato's vision that's valuable?
Definitely. His entire model might be unrealistic, but there are some parts that still hold important lessons.
Okay, like what? What's still relevant?
Well, his focus on wisdom, virtue, ethical leadership, those are all super relevant. We might not have philosopher kings, but we can all try to be more thoughtful, informed, and ethical.
So cultivate those qualities in ourselves.
Yeah.
And expect them from our leaders, no matter what system we live under.
Exactly. And beyond individual responsibility, Plato's ideas encourage us to think critically about power structures.
About how we can create more just and equitable societies.
That's the big takeaway. Even if his philosopher king never shows up, Plato's ideas push us to strive for something better, both individually and as a society.
But if not philosopher kings, then what? What other models have emerged over time?
That's a perfect transition. Join us for part 3, where we'll explore those alternative systems and see where Plato fits into the big picture of political thought.
Welcome back to our deep dive with Plato. We've explored his ideas on democracy, his vision of the philosopher-king, and some criticisms of his model.
We've definitely covered a lot of ground, but before we wrap things up, I think it's important to step back and look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, the historical context. Ancient Athens, right. What was it really like back then? Their democracy, was it anything like we see today?
It was quite different, actually. They had what's called a direct democracy.
Direct democracy.
Yeah, so citizens participated directly in decision-making through assemblies and voting rather than electing representatives.
Wow, no elected officials. That's pretty different from what we're used to.
Big difference. It was a groundbreaking system for its time, but it wasn't as inclusive as modern democracies.
How so?
Well, women, slaves, and foreigners weren't allowed to participate in political life.
Oh, okay. That's, well, a pretty sizable chunk of the population excluded.
Right, so even though Athenian democracy was innovative, it definitely had its limits.
So, not exactly the ideal of rule by the people that we often associate with democracy today.
Right, and even among those who could participate, there were concerns about, how decisions were actually made. Plato was worried about the influence of rhetoric.
The art of persuasion.
Exactly. He felt like skillful speakers could sway people's emotions, lead them to make decisions that weren't necessarily based on, sound judgment.
So, not always about logic and reason.
Not always. And remember, this was after Athens had lost the Peloponnesian War against Sparta.
A pretty devastating defeat.
It was. And this experience likely reinforced Plato's anxieties about the effectiveness of democratic leadership, especially during times of crisis.
Makes sense. After such a significant loss, you'd start to question if the system was really working.
And that's what led him to this idea of the Philosopher-King, to try and fix what he saw as the weaknesses of Athenian democracy. Create a system that prioritized wisdom and reason.
It was his solution, even if it seems a bit extreme to us now. But it's important to understand the context, right? The world he was living in.
Absolutely. His ideas didn't come out of thin air. He was influenced by earlier thinkers.
And by the events happening around him, it's all connected.
It is. It's like this ongoing conversation, this dialogue that's been happening for centuries. And while we've been focused on Plato and his ideas, there have been countless other approaches to governance throughout history.
So many different ways to organize societies and make decisions.
Right. From ancient republics to modern democracies.
Each with its own strengths and weaknesses.
Exactly. Its own unique challenges.
It's like this giant experiment in human governance, constantly trying to figure out the best way to create a thriving and just society.
I love that analogy. And we may never find the perfect system.
But the search continues.
It does. And I think that ongoing search, it's a testament to our desire for a better world.
It is. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Plato's world, what are the key takeaways? What can we learn from him, even if we don't agree with everything he said?
Well, one of the biggest lessons, I think, is the importance of critical thinking. Questioning assumptions.
Not just taking things at face value.
Exactly. Challenge the status quo. Never stop seeking wisdom and truth.
Even if it means questioning our own beliefs, the systems we live under.
Precisely. Another big takeaway is the importance of ethical leadership. Leaders who are driven by a desire to serve the common good, not by their own ambitions.
That's a really powerful idea, focusing on the well-being of the entire community.
And lastly, I think Plato reminds us that creating a just and harmonious society, it's an ongoing process. It requires constant reflection, open debate, and a willingness to learn from our mistakes.
To keep striving for something better.
Exactly. So even if Plato's Philosopher-King remains a utopian ideal, his ideas continue to inspire us to think critically about how we govern ourselves and to cultivate those qualities of wisdom and virtue in our own lives.
It's been a fascinating journey back to ancient Greece. So much to think about.
It has. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
And for our listeners, keep those philosophical gears turning, question everything, keep learning. Until next time.